Greetings YouTube, this is Remarkable Republican, here once again to bring you the truth with a truth-flavored bias. Today we're taking a look at gay Union generals. This will be part 1 of 2. This will be about the homosexual commanders in blue. In the past I've done videos on gay Confederate generals, including a dedicated video about Robert E. Lee, who was a homosexual. Now, today what I'm doing is presenting some older research that I did that I didn't make into a video at the time because I didn't think there was much interest in it, but in recent days I've gotten quite a few comments on my old Gay Confederate Generals video asking for similar coverage of Union soldiers, so I decided that now was the time. There will be a volume 2 in the near future. I have some incomplete research that I'm finishing up now. But don't concern yourself with that now because we have 3 different generals that we're talking about today who were in fact gay Union generals. First up is John F. Reynolds. Reynolds was born in 1820. He attended and graduated from West Point. He fought in an Indian War in Oregon in 1856, and then he was immediately reassigned to participate in the Utah War of 1857-1858. This was to put down a Mormon uprising during that period. In 1860 until 1861, right as the Civil War was breaking out, Reynolds served as commandant of cadets at West Point, so he was effectively the dean of the school. During the Civil War, he served in the Army of the Potomac. His actual process of getting to an initial command was really complicated, but eventually he ended up as a brigade commander. He did well, became a division commander, continued to do well, and then was promoted to corps command. He saved the Union Army at 2nd Manassas with a daring charge. That was his greatest feat, and the thing he's probably most famous for is actually dying in battle on the first day of Gettysburg, where he was the person who decided to fight at Gettysburg, so he deserves some of the credit for the Union victory on that day. So, let's look at the evidence for John F. Reynolds' homosexuality now that we've established who he is. During his time in Utah in 1857-58, it is quite possible that John Reynolds had threesomes with local Mormon couples. He most likely participated in the local swinging community at the time, which was part of the Mormon religion in the 19th century, and during this time he most likely had sex with both men and women as part of his membership in this swinging community. When he was commandant at West Point a few years later, it was said that he frequently flirted with cadets and instructors, and some people found it somewhat charming, but a lot of other people found it rather creepy. Reynolds only got engaged at about the age of 40, right before the Civil War, to a Catholic girl. He was Protestant. That actually mattered back then quite a bit because people took their religion very seriously. And the match was unlikely to ever result in marriage because this Catholic girl's parents were unlikely to approve of him unless he became the next Grant, which he wasn't really on a path to do, as we'll see. Despite doing well in every battle he fought in and being an excellent organizer, someone who was clearly a competent general, Reynolds was not given command of the Army of the Potomac after the defeat at Chancellorsville. Lincoln instead chose to give the Army command to Reynolds' former subordinate, George Meade. The reason for this is because he was suspicious of Reynolds' moral character, i.e. he had heard rumors that Reynolds was in fact a homosexual, and if that were to come out and spread among the ranks, that would massively demoralize the Army and lead to more defeats. Now, with the South invading the North, he couldn't risk that at all. Had the circumstances been a little less tense, maybe he would have taken the chance on putting a potentially gay man in charge, but Lincoln decided to err on the side of caution, and of course, Reynolds would still play a role at Gettysburg, and Meade would go on to win the battle, mostly due to the shittiness of James Longstreet. Next up is General Benjamin F. Butler. He was a prominent politician from the leftist state of Massachusetts, and he was a politician both before, during, and after the Civil War. There were plenty of political generals in the Union Army, which is why it sucked to a large degree, and none of them got more commands and opportunities to show how bad they were than Ben Butler. In 1861, he had an early success when he led some militia in the Maryland, and he was able to threaten the state assembly from seceding from the Union. This, of course, was an act of thuggery, and it undermined democracy. However, from the Union perspective, this was a victory, and this made people think that maybe this Butler guy wasn't so bad. During the Virginia Peninsula Campaign of 1862, he bungled early, but he did capture Fort Monroe, which meant that the Union had a naval base in Virginia for the entire war. He was the very first in the Union to decide not to honor the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, when owners came to him and demanded that slaves who had fled the Union lines be returned. This quickly became Union Army policy because they didn't want to contradict something that he had already done, so that ended up just becoming a thing that they did, and they sort of stumbled into the Emancipation Proclamation. That was kind of the start of that, I guess you could say. Later, Butler was reassigned to be military governor of New Orleans after the fall of that city, and as we'll see, there were some problems with what he did while he was governor there. In 1864, he was removed from New Orleans and reassigned to the Army of the James. This is an army in the Virginia Peninsula, once again, coming from Norfolk and Fort Monroe. Basically, this was a time when he just straight up got mauled by General Lee in a couple of battles, and even though he had a bunch of men and he had the numerical advantage and the qualitative advantage and a Navy presence and all kinds of things, he just wasn't able to get anything done. He was then sent to North Carolina to attack Fort Fisher, and he failed in his attack there in embarrassing fashion. He went back to Congress and told them that it couldn't be taken, so they never attempted it again, and the fort stood to the end of the war, but Butler never got another command. And now, the case for Ben Butler's homosexuality. Butler was a slimy politician. He used his connections to get appointments. He basically did among men what most women do among each other when they are gossiping as housewives or gossiping in an office setting. In New Orleans, he was very unpopular for his law allowing troops to treat women like prostitutes if they showed disrespect. Effectively, what this means is that he was acting like a petty, aggrieved housewife who is striking out at her rivals by using her husband's power. Butler was behaving very much like a woman while he was governor of New Orleans and reacting in this way. In the French Quarter, Butler reportedly engaged in homosexual acts with free blacks. Now, a lot of unionist historians like to say that this was just a smear by the locals, but these reports have persisted to this day, and it is very likely that this is what Butler was doing in his spare time. Grant also was no fan of Butler. He detested him, in fact, and if there's one thing we know about Ulysses S. Grant, he had a very well-known and vocalized anti-gay bias. Another thing about Butler that most people don't realize is that Butler was very interested in machines and gadgets, and he loved to tinker with them. This included everything from new wheel spokes to new rifles to the newly invented Gatling gun. Butler was always interested in using all these new weapons because he didn't really understand tactics very well, but he was really into gadgets and gizmos. And this obsession with tinkering with gadgets that you don't really understand is very much a trait that is typical of gay men. Last and, well, frankly least, James H. Ledlie. Ledlie spent most of the war in coastal North Carolina serving as an artilleryman from early 1862 to March 1864. His rise through the ranks was steady, but by the time that he left the army in North Carolina and joined Grant's army in Virginia, he had been promoted to brigade commander, so he was at least a colonel or brigadier general. On June 9th, after his division commander was killed in action, Ledlie was promoted to command the 1st Division of Burnside's 9th Corps. It's worth noting that the infantry unit that he commanded was not an artillery unit, so he was pretty much out of place. He really didn't have any experience with the infantry prior to his appointment just a couple months before. Ledlie is most famous for being tasked with exploiting the opening created by the mining operation at the Battle of the Crater, and he proved to be an incredibly bad general during that operation. Although, to be fair, this was not exactly the greatest plan to begin with. The result was famously a catastrophe and a massive setback for the Union efforts at Richmond. And now the evidence for the homosexuality of James Ledlie. While he was in North Carolina, he showed a distinct lack of character by allowing his boredom to lead him to alcoholism. At Cold Harbor, when he was already in command of his brigade and just days away from taking command of his division, Ledlie was noticeably absent from the front lines during the fighting and did not lead his men in the battle. It was expected that division commanders and lower would always be present on the front lines, but Ledlie came across as cowardly, which is evidence of his homosexual inclinations. During the Battle of the Crater, Ledlie spent the entire battle in his command tent having a sex party with a staff officer named Captain B.R. Jordan. This is quite well documented, and it is in his court-martial. Ledlie was mostly removed, of course, for failing to do this attack and also being drunk during the battle. But when they found out that he and one of his staff officers were having an affair, it was pretty disgusting and shocking. But really, they would have never known had he just done his job, because no one really liked Ledlie that much. He was kind of a weird dude, and apparently he smelled bad, so they never really would have looked into him too much, but he sort of made them. The attack was going horribly. About 3,000 or 4,000 men got killed, and then they're looking for Ledlie. They assumed he'd gotten killed leading the assault. Then they get back to his tent, and he and this other dude are drinking and having sex. So that is Volume 1 of Gay Civil War Generals, at least on the Union side. Next time we'll do Volume 2 of Gay Union Generals. Until then, I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with truth-flavored bias. Signing out.